So our keynote speaker tonight is also an F-14 guy. We're taking over. So, taking over. Mark Keller, call sign Slider. I met him in my third deployment on the USS Enterprise with Fighter Squadron 14. He was a lieutenant, F-14 radar intercept officer. So they're the ones in the back, navigating, running all the equipment, basically telling me where to go. I called him my cruise wife. And we got to fly a lot of important missions, including that deployment just happened to coincide with 2001. And so we're in the Persian Gulf when 9/11 occurred. And so Mark and I have flown multiple combat missions over Afghanistan. Unfortunately, after that deployment, much like happens in the military, I lost contact with him until just a few years ago. I've reacquainted with him. He's also involved in some other veterans organizations that my wife and I are also involved in. Tonight, it's going to be a very interesting discussion with Mark. He's gone through a lot of challenges, both through military service and, at 42, prostate cancer. And so, as you can tell, military personnel in general, especially military aviators, are really suffering the brunt of this disease. And I want to be a part of helping to bring that to the forefront, early diagnosis, and helping our fellow brothers. So tonight, I'm going to introduce Mark Keller, call sign Slider. And I want to listen very closely to a very, very interesting story of his. Slider.
Thanks, kid. Cruise wife, huh? That's good. We can talk about that later. I got a question for you guys. How do you know if there's a fighter pilot at your cocktail party? He'll tell you. So when Kid called me up and asked if I would come up and tell my story, I said, sure, people have to listen to me. This is great. Prostate cancer's definitely a part of it a couple times in my story, but there's some other stuff in there. I'm going to talk about some mental health stuff, PTSD, the way these things affect your life after you get out of the military, some of the things I think we could do better, and maybe some ways we can do it better. But I'll just jump in there and tell you who I am. My name's Mark Keller, fighter call sign Slider. Was born in upstate New York to Ken and Judy Keller. My parents are still married 57 years now, quite a miracle. Great people. My dad has prostate cancer. He's 90 years old. It's never been treated and apparently isn't an issue. I guess like most men who make it to the age of 65 are going to die with prostate cancer, not necessarily of it. So he's lucky. His was not very aggressive. But into my story. I grew up watching I Dream of Jeannie. Anyone know that show, I Dream of Jeannie? Yeah. Major Nelson was a hero of mine as a kid. I was always, fascinated with the idea of space exploration. I spent a lot of time staring at the moon with my telescope and all that stuff. And I think as young as 5 years old, I had a astronaut costume that I used to wear to bed. I was that into it. May or may not have had something to do with the Barbara Eden, one of the most beautiful women in the world. But I was 5, so who knows? But so I always wanted to be an astronaut. That was it was just very clear to me that that's what I wanted to do from a very young age. And fast forward a little bit through high school, I got good grades. I played a bunch of sports. It was kind of fitting the profile a little bit. I got accepted to Penn State, went in as electrical engineering major. Probably wasn't as focused on my education as I should have been. Penn State's a fun place, I'll tell you. Won a football national championship while I was there. That was pretty good. Majored in social life, if you observed what I spent my time on. I did very well at that. I think I had a volleyball class, too, that I got an A in that, which was good because I would eventually fly F-14s, and you got to play volleyball. In your jeans and with your shirt off, so it keeps you working out. Just, you never know who's going to see that. So yeah, my grades weren't going to get me to the space program right away, so I had to go find something else to do. So I went ahead and enlisted in the United States Air Force. This was in 1987. I went through boot camp in San Antonio, Texas in the middle of July. That was a real hoot. They taught me how to swear. That was new. That was really good. And when it came time to select my area of expertise, I went for electronic warfare. I remember I'd been an electrical engineering major, and I picked the longest technical school that the Air Force offers, and that was electronic warfare, which deals with radar jammers, radar signal processing, detection, stuff like that, countermeasures. Pretty interesting stuff. So I spent a year in Biloxi, Mississippi, going through that school. That was an interesting time. There were no casinos there. You never left base without a couple buddies with you, because you might not make it back. It was just a very different time. But from there, I figured I was going to go to Europe. So they have something called your dream sheet. So you get to put on there all the places you want to go and serve. And so I started at Ramstein, Germany, and I circled out and named every base, and there was a plethora of them back then. And I just knew I was going to Europe. And unfortunately, all the Air Force saw was that I was an overseas volunteer, and they sent me to South Korea, which was an interesting place in 1988. There was a lot of political unrest. I remember one time coming up, we went to Seoul, and I was coming up out of the subway, and all these Koreans were just running towards me down from the street level. And of course, I had to go see what was going on up there. So I went the other way, and they were throwing Molotov cocktails, and tear gas was everywhere, and all that stuff. It was pretty exciting stuff. The Olympics came through there in 1988. I got to go to some of those events and all that. But we were operating up pretty far north, just south of Seoul, at a little base called Suwon, which is not a U.S. base. That's a Korean air base. They had some squadrons of F-5s there. We had some A-10s. The A-10s were there. They're slow-moving aircraft, but they carry bombs and a big gun made to take armor out. And at that time, the North Koreans were very active. There was always this threat that they were going to come through these tunnels. They had dug under the demilitarized zone. So we were constantly doing exercises in MOP gear. That's mission-oriented protective posture. So this is chemical, biological, radiological threats. I can tell you wearing a rubber suit from head to toe in Korea is not fun. It is a hot, steamy place most of the year, and that was pretty stressful. I got pretty used to thinking that something really bad was about to happen. But I survived that just fine. I was very lucky. I got to go to Hurlburt Field down in beautiful Fort Walton Beach, Florida. They did reward me for taking Europe away from me, and spent a couple years down there with the 1st Special Operations Wing, doing electronic warfare stuff. We got to do some really neat stuff back then. We went and ran around in the jungle in Honduras. We flew airplanes off of aluminum matting in the middle of the jungle, makeshift runways. We were chasing some guys around, Nicaragua and all that, if you know what was going on at that time. It was pretty neat stuff. We went and got Manuel Noriega. Pretty neat stuff again there. So somewhere in there, I realized that it was time for me to get serious about my education and get back on that astronaut track. So I applied for ROTC, didn't get it. I dug a pretty good numerical hole for myself at Penn State. So just said, okay, I'm just going to work my way through school. So I got into the University of Florida as an electrical engineer again. I worked 2 jobs. One 5 days a week, one on the weekends. During the week, I had a very high security clearance because of my electronic warfare stuff. So there was a laboratory at the University of Florida where they did all kinds of radar research. They worked with MIT Lincoln Labs and the Army Research Lab, and we built prototype radars. Some pretty interesting stuff. We built radar proximity fuses. We did some of the early research on ground penetrating radars. We built the processor for the Longbow fire control radar, which is on the Apache helicopter. And so that was interesting work because we were teaching the radar how to recognize the difference between a rock and a truck, or a Soviet truck and a US truck, and all that stuff with some early neural network processors and all that stuff. Pretty cutting edge stuff, really interesting work, very intellectually satisfying. And I'd kind of given up on the astronaut thing at that point and decided I was just going to be a college professor. However, my weekend job was jumping out of airplanes. So I became a freefall photographer. I was on the University of Florida parachute demonstration team, and I was the guy that had all the big cameras on my helmet, and I would jump out and do all these things. That was super fun, and I made money jumping out of airplanes. So there was a stark contrast between these two aspects of my life. And one day I was sitting in the lab, and I was looking at the dude that they just got the special chair for because he had carpal tunnel syndrome and the thick glasses and his pasty white and skinny guy, and it just hit me that these are not my people. So I literally pushed my chair back and said, "What's the coolest thing in the world?" And I remembered my dream again. I said, I want to be an astronaut. So, the internet was very experimental at that time. It wasn't easy to just Google something. But I did a little dig around and figured out that the best way to become an astronaut was to go through Navy test pilot school, which turns out I was pretty well qualified for. So I got the yellow pages out, and I found the Navy recruiter, and I called him up, and I said, I want to fly those F-14s. Of course, Top Gun was out at this point, so it had to be F-14s. And the volleyball. So so the recruiter said, well, there's a couple of hoops you got to jump. He laughed at me. He's like, well, you can't just sign up for that. There's a couple of things you got to do. So I went and took the tests, and I did just fine, and it all worked out. I ended up flying F-14s, which was pretty cool. So I got my wings down in Pensacola in late 1997. Went to Virginia Beach, Virginia, the F-14 training squadron up there, VF-101 Grim Reapers. Went through that syllabus and learned how to run radar intercepts, how to employ weapons, lasers, all kinds of stuff like that, tactical communications. Basically, driving my work wife around by speaking in his ear, because really, it's just a monkey up there. There's two anchors on these wings for a reason, right? Okay, we're even now. So I graduated from my F-14 syllabus, and the first thing I did was went straight to Kosovo. Kosovo was an interesting conflict. The Serbian army had moved into Kosovo, which is a former Republic of Yugoslavia, but they considered themselves to be somewhat sovereign and mostly populated by ethnic Albanians that had migrated in hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And the Serbian army was going around basically committing genocide. It was a very, very ugly time in the world for sure, and we were the only aircraft carrier there. The other thing about Kosovo is that they had fourth-generation Soviet integrated air defenses. So they had very sophisticated search radars, detection, missile guidance systems, radar-guided missiles. They even made some modifications to those things where they could launch them optically and then guide them with a radar. Made these things very, very lethal. Because of that, we flew really fast and pulled a lot of G's every single time we were over the fence into what we call Indian country. So it was really hard work. It was athletic, to say the least. You're pulling 5, 6 G's pretty much all the time. We never flew in a straight line, always just pulling G's. They were shooting at us all the time. Very stressful. Very stressful on the mind and on the body. And we were successful. It's the only time in the history of warfare where a invading force has been driven off using air power alone. So that was really cool to be part of that history. Let me talk about a couple things I saw on the ship. So I was I was not a Naval Academy guy. I hadn't done summer cruises like an RTC guy or anything like that. I'd never been on a ship before. So I show up on the ship, and the first night I was taking a shower, and the water smelled funny. And I didn't understand what that was. So I asked somebody, and there's something about all naval vessels, they have a lot of what they call voids in the hull, so these big empty spaces. On an aircraft carrier, there's all kinds of stuff you put in these voids. One of them is drinking water, but the preponderance of those spaces are filled up with ballast, which is jet fuel. It's basically kerosene with a bunch of other stuff in it. Well, guess what happens when you put big steel ships in salt water? Things rust, they leak. We drank jet fuel, we showered in it regularly. It's just a thing. Sometimes we get out of the shower, you smell like jet fuel. Thought that was odd. Another one, because I was the new guy in the squadron when we launched our first strikes into Kosovo, I didn't get to fly on the first night, which made me very sad. It was an exciting night. I wish I'd kept a journal on it. I remember being up on the superstructure of the aircraft watching all the aircraft launch off into the night. It was just really exciting stuff. You know, everyone was nervous. We didn't know if everyone was going to make it back. And all the catwalks up there were just absolutely packed with people with their video recorders for obvious reasons. Now, what's interesting is when you go up there with your video recorder, if you don't wrap it in tinfoil, it doesn't work. You just get all kinds of noise. The number of antennas spinning around up there, transmitters, some of it radar, some of it communications. I mean, I couldn't even tell you, there's dozens of them. So you can't make a video recording without shielding those cameras. I now wonder if maybe we should have wrapped ourselves in tinfoil too, but that would have looked silly, and we were all cool, so we weren't gonna do that. So that was pretty exciting stuff. So that was Kosovo. It was about 65 days of dropping tons and tons and tons of laser-guided bombs, more so than pretty much anyone in the Navy at that point had done, or the Air Force. We set all kinds of records for the number of laser-guided weapons we delivered, and so I learned a lot about the capabilities, the limitations of these laser-guided weapons, which will come into play a little bit later on a later deployment. We then went to Iraq. And we flew those southern no-fly zone missions. You know, Saddam was constantly testing us, launching enemy fighters out of the north, and we would run intercepts on these guys, or they'd move some surface-to-air missiles down below the 33rd parallel, and we would retaliate the next day by dropping some bombs on them. And it was just back and forth, back and forth. It, you know, gone on for over a decade at that point. That turned out to be fairly routine stuff, you know, compared to the rest of what we did. Fast forward to my second deployment, 2001, on the USS Enterprise with Kid here. That was a little bit of a love boat cruise. I think we hit like 14 ports in the Med or something like that. My liver was not in good shape after all that. We had a lot of fun. It was great. We flew like crazy. We trained and trained and trained, and it was a great time. We went to the Persian Gulf, and again, flew a whole lot of Southern Watch missions, which are, you know, it's armed reconnaissance. You know, we go really fast, we look around, we fly the same pork chop pattern up towards the 33rd and over towards Iran and back down over Basra. Every day we did the same thing. Wasn't really that exciting, but for our squadron, VF-14, and our sister squadron, VF-41, we were going to be the first squadrons to get rid of our F-14s and replace them with F-18 Super Hornets. So this was somewhat of a historic cruise. I mean, you know, we had the oldest airplanes in the fleet. They were all built in the mid to late 60s at that point. We didn't have GPS. We all bought Garmin, little GPS units, and we put Velcro on the instrument panel, and that's how we navigated. It was really that primitive. I remember flying up into Pakistan on our way to Kabul, and I just said, okay, we're going north. The mountains are on our left. I know we're still in Pakistan. And then we would hop over the mountains. I mean, it was that primitive. But I got ahead of myself a little bit there. So we were going to head to port in South Africa, which hadn't been done by a naval, at least not a nuclear-powered Navy ship in over 20 years. So we set up, we were going to do a shark dive. We were going to dive with the great whites in cages, and we were going to go on a safari, and we had all this cool stuff planned, and we were all excited about that. And we went through the Straits of Hormuz, headed down the south coast, the east coast of Africa on, what was that, September 9th, I think? The night between September 8th and September 9th, we always go through in the dark. obviously, September 11th was just a couple days away. So we were steaming south. I think we're probably off the southern tip of Somalia at that point in the northern Indian Ocean. I had the honor of being scheduled to do a post-maintenance check flight on one of the birds that had been cannibalized for parts the whole cruise. So they put it all together because we had to fly it off when we got home. So lucky me, I got to sit in the ready room and wait for that thing to come up and take it flying and make sure the wings weren't going to fall off and all that stuff. So I was sitting alone in the ready room with the duty officer. Of course, everybody else, probably includes kid, was sleeping. When I watched the first plane hit the World Trade Center. Like most of you, when I saw the second plane hit, I knew exactly what was going on. It was a little bit different for us out there, though. We turned the ship around in 3 minutes. I looked at my watch. It was 3 minutes after the second plane hit. That ship made a big old left turn and headed up off the coast of Pakistan. We could have flown strikes into Afghanistan the next night, easily. We couldn't because State Department had to work out overflight of Pakistan. We had to get some Air Force tankers in there and stuff like that. But we were right there ready to go. So we spent 3 weeks getting intelligence briefs about how if we had to bail out and got captured by the Taliban, they were going to peel our skin off and all that stuff. We all agreed that we were going to do something we don't normally do when we fly, is we were going to make sure we had a round in the chamber of our sidearm, so if we ended up on the ground, we could take ourselves out before we got peeled. A little stressful. But we flew the first strikes into Afghanistan. First few nights, we took out all their missile defenses and all that. And after that, it was basically, we called it dropping Corvettes on rusty old trucks. So we did that for about 6 weeks or so before the next carrier showed up to relieve us. We saw a little bit of small arms fire and stuff like that. But other than the first couple of nights, there wasn't a whole lot. But what we did get to do is we got to drop a whole lot of these laser-guided bombs again. Same ones we were using in Kosovo. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time twice and just got a ton of experience with these bombs, which was pretty cool. Remember, I'm an engineer. I'm looking at these things maybe a little different than some people do. So we made it home. We got rid of our F-14s. I did some other stuff for a while. Went to school, went to the Naval War College, got a master's degree in strategic studies and national security policy. Later ended up for my third deployment on Carrier Air Wing 8 staff. And the Carrier Air Wing is, the commander of the Carrier Air Wing is a Navy captain, just like the captain of the ship is, except all the squadron commanders on the aircraft carrier work for him. So I was on the aircraft, the Air Wing commander's staff as the strike operations officer. One of the responsibilities of the strike operations officer is to advise the commanding officer on how weapons should be employed, what tactics we're going to use, what's appropriate for the theater we're going into, the threat, the kinds of targets we have to service, and stuff like that. So it was part of my job to look ahead at the mission reports that were coming back from the air wing that was ahead of us in the Gulf. Now, this was 2005. So we invaded, the second invasion of Iraq was in 2003. In 2005, Marines were having a hard time at Fallujah. Everyone knows about that. That was some difficult times for the United States Marine Corps. We were trying to track down al-Qaeda networks. We were identifying safe houses, weapon caches, who were their leaders. I personally got to chase al-Zakari around in a truck one night. They knew what truck he was in, and I couldn't get a bomb on him because he was in a populated area and he kept moving. I think the Air Force got him about a year later. Because we were going after these al-Qaeda safe houses in urban areas, I was very concerned about collateral damage. And I told this to my boss, the Air Wing commander, repeatedly, that I think we needed to get away from the tactics that had been recommended by Top Gun at that point. Now, little break about Top Gun. The movie is not right. It's actually pretty stupid. Great movie, I'm not saying that, but it's kind of stupid. What Top Gun really is a schoolhouse. This is where you send, usually your best guys. They go there and they, go really deep on the way we do business in the airplane, how we use weapons, and they come up with recommendations. They have access to test guys. They have access to Raytheon engineers and all this stuff. And they have all the pieces they need there to try to come up with good decisions. However, it's humans. And humans sometimes make mistakes. So at this time, the recommendation for dropping these bombs was that, we should go really fast. We should turn the laser on at a certain time or not a certain time, depending on what altitude you are. There's a whole set of rules. But what I saw was that those rules did not apply to what we were doing in Iraq in 2005. In 2005, what we really needed to do was go as slow as we could, get right over our targets and try to drop those bombs straight down. Because the steeper those impacts angles are, the less chance of collateral damage there is. So turns out that my Air Wing commander was a former Top Gun CO. There was no way I was going to convince him to, on the first time he deployed and actually used a weapon in combat, go against what Top Gun recommended. So it just wasn't, I couldn't get him there. I spent night after night after night in his office trying to tell him that we should do business a different way, and he just wasn't having it. So at one point, the deputy Air Wing commander grabbed me in the passageway in the dark and said, "Hey, Slider, I appreciate your passion. You got to shut up. You're pissing the boss off." Aye, aye, sir. I mean, what am I going to say at this point? So you can probably see where this is going. A couple months later, I'm mission commander on a mission over this little town called Baji, about 60 miles northwest of Baghdad. On the previous night, some guys had detonated an IED in the road and had killed a bunch of U.S. Army personnel in a Humvee. The next night, I just happened to be the guy overhead when an Iraqi woman came into the police station and said, "There's some dudes doing some weird things out in that same road where that thing happened last night." And a whole sequence of communications and interpreters and all this stuff went on. But eventually I got on the radio. We found these guys on our sensor. And we were authorized to drop a bomb on them. Now, the guy in the front seat was one of my students when I was an F-14 instructor. Young guy, happened to be a senior lieutenant just because they had a weird turnaround cycle. So he was senior, but had no experience whatsoever. I work for his boss, so I'm a guest in this squadron's airplane. So we had an argument in the cockpit. I said, "Dude, trust me, I've delivered over 60 of these weapons. We got to go real high, we got to go real slow, we got to make sure that thing comes in there steep." And he said, No, the boss said we're going to go fast and we're going to go low and we're going to do this. And I'm like, "Man, it's going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem." Couldn't convince him. So we set up for our bombing run, we come out, we turn in, and I just couldn't decide if I was going to turn that laser on at the time that gave it the best chance to be steep or at the time that was going to leave it dragging in low and possibly hit short. It was a moral dilemma because if I did it the way I was told, I was protected. No matter what happened with that bomb, I was protected. If I did it the way I knew to be morally correct and that bomb hit the way I wanted it to, I've proved nothing, probably going to get chewed out. I can get chewed out. I'm used to that. But if I do it my way and the bomb misses anyway, I could end up in Leavenworth. And so I had a serious moral dilemma in the cockpit on that night. And I'll tell you, when the bomb came off, I turned the laser on right away. I hadn't decided what I was going to do, but I turned it on the wrong way, the way I was ordered to turn it on. And the bomb hit short, and I killed 12 innocent people in the house next door. Yeah. Last couple of years, I stopped crying about it. That weighed very, very, very heavily on me. I took that home with me. I had a beautiful young wife and 2 young kids, and about a month after that, on our nightly email exchange, she said, "Oh, I'm looking for you. Are you coming home, honey?" And I said, "I don't want to come home." Guys, this happens all the time. I'm not special at all. This happens all the time. You know, when you're in a combat environment, you have to be on your game all the time. You have to perform at 100% or above all the time because oftentimes your life depends on it. If you don't do that, you don't live, or the mission fails, which, you know, in that community is almost as bad. So you get really, really good at a couple things. One is you get good at operating at a very high level. We call it fight or flight, right? Your cortisol is up, your adrenaline, your mind is racing, your vision is enhanced, your hearing's enhanced. All these things. This is a very primitive physiological response. The other thing that happens is when bad things happen, you get very, very good at taking those things and putting them in a box and forgetting about them, because you can't let it affect you while you're operating these aircraft, while you're in combat, while you have a mission to do. So these things become habits. You become used to operating at a very high level of excitation all the time. You get used to compartmentalizing everything, just putting it in a box and soldiering on. And over multiple deployments, what happens is your physiology adapts to this. You have neuroadaptations which cause you to be stuck in this state of high excitation and cortisol-soaked excitation. Does that have something to do with prostate cancer? It might. Kind of seems like it. We need to find out. You know, so that's one of those things. And then when I came home, probably didn't know what PTSD was at that point. It was easy to understand if your best buddy gets his head blown off in the foxhole next to you, you're going to wake up screaming and be a drunk, right? We've all seen the movies. For most people, that's not really what it is. It's just being exposed to that high-intensity environment over and over and over again. It just becomes what you're used to. And when you come back to the real world, everything's moving in slow motion. I didn't understand that at the time. We're going to get to the really bad part here in a minute. I didn't understand that. Nobody educated us about it. You never heard about it. You do now. We're getting a little bit better on that. But at that time, we didn't know what to look for. We didn't understand what was going on with our own bodies and our own minds. So I come back from that deployment depressed. Probably drinking a little more than I should. My wife didn't like that. Probably a year went by or something like that after I got back from that deployment. But she eventually threw me out of the house. I wasn't being mean or getting in fights or anything like that. I was just sad. I was just really sad, and I was numbing myself out with alcohol. And she threw me out of the house. 3 months after that, on a routine flight physical, I happened to mention to the flight surgeon that I had a frequent urgent onset of the need to urinate. I just mentioned it to him casually. I didn't know what a prostate was. I know all about it now, but I barely knew. Like, kid, it's a thing that guys have. I knew that. Wasn't sure what it did, where it was, anything like that. But, I had this urgent need to urinate all the time. So he gave me a PSA test. Came back. My number was 17, I think, at that point. Probably been around for a while. Yeah, it's pretty high. I'm 42 years old at this point. And the doc, I think rightly, says to me, it's probably just prostatitis. You're only 42 years old. You're otherwise perfectly healthy. It's prostatitis. So he throws me on Cipro, which is the mother of all antibiotics, for a couple of weeks. Go back, get another PSA test. I'm at 19 now. Yeah, no kidding. I had no idea what that meant at the time. I learned all this later. But he's like, this is bad, dude. You need to go see the oncologist. So went to Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, which is an excellent facility, and had a biopsy. How many guys in here have had a biopsy? Yeah, no danger of becoming a recreational activity, is it? Right? It's not. I'd done a lot of scary things. I had over 1,000 jumps out of airplanes at that point. I'd been shot at. I'd landed on aircraft carriers. I'd been on fire in an airplane twice. None of that was as scary as my biopsy. You know, they come out with a thing about the size of this microphone, and they go in the wrong way with it. I guess that's the ultrasound probe they get in there. It's not fun. You know, I was a pretty tough guy. I think I still am. I was a pretty tough guy. I'll tell you, by the time they got done punching that needle through the front wall of my rectum, they had to pry my fingers off the side of the gurney. And I was soaked in sweat. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, these guys are nodding back. You know what I'm talking about. That's some rough stuff. It's also not a very accurate way to measure what state your prostate cancer is in. It's not at all. They came back, you know, on the right lobe. I had a couple of hits, not real bad. On the left side, a few more, still not that bad. They called it Gleason 3A. They said, oh, it's not that aggressive. We caught it early. You're going to be good. And they sent me, you know, to the surgeon and said, oh, you're going to have surgery. I didn't know what the options were. I barely knew what a prostate was at that point. So I went in there, talked to the doc. Of course, he wanted to cut at me. So I'm sitting here thinking, of course he wants to cut me. He's a surgeon. That's what they do, right? And I didn't like the doctor. I'm sure he was competent, but I didn't feel comfortable with him. Maybe I was in shock a little bit. I don't know. It just didn't really vibe with the guy. So I went and sought out another physician. I went up to Walter Reed Medical Center, which, by the way, is a fantastic facility, now combined with Bethesda. You know, there's a lot of stink that went on around that back in, you know, the early teens, 2010, around that. You know, we got a lot of bad press. It was totally undeserved. That was a wonderful facility. I found a great oncologist. He explained everything to me in a way that I could understand, told me why we needed to have surgery, and convinced me that we could. I was 42 and newly single. Kind of wanted things to work, you know, when I got done. I thought my life would be over if it didn't. Really was a knucklehead. I don't know how I got as far as I did, but anyway. So I went and had the Da Vinci robot, had a radical prostatectomy, nerve sparing, because of, you know, what we found with the biopsy. I could get away with that, they thought. That went well. It sucked. I mean, I'm not gonna tell you it was fun or anything, but you know, it went reasonably well. And when the pathology came back, I was stage 4B, I think is what, I can't even remember what the numbers are, but it was outside my capsule. It had traveled up through my seminal vesicles. It was in, it was all over the place. No MRI. Thank you. Why is there no imagery for this? This is ridiculous. It's barbaric. It's barbaric, and it's what they said. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. They got it way wrong. Now, I was lucky. I did have nerve-sparing surgery, and when the pathology came back, they found that my margins were clean, which was encouraging. They wanted me to do scavenger radiation. Right. So by this point, I had put myself through medical school, basically. No offense to people who actually went to medical school. I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express, but no, I knew I knew with the surgery I was going to have erectile dysfunction in the short term. I knew there was some danger of incontinence. I got all that stuff, and I was willing to accept that. And you know, I started my new job up in D.C. here, wearing diapers for my first few months. You know, away from my family. Basically had no support system at this point. Started a new job, didn't know anybody up here. Was working my ass off in a 12-hour a day job. I was you know, working directly for a 3-star. I think that really kind of tipped me over the edge. You know, I was not prepared to have my manhood mutilated which is how I looked at it. You know, I was gonna be less of a man. You know, there was no prep for the emotional aspects of this experience that I was having. I didn't have my own support system. I had nothing. I was just utterly alone through all this stuff. Now, as a guy who's used to putting big elephants in boxes, whatever, I just toughed it out and just started drinking more. I drank a lot. Did my job. I functioned, but I wasn't living a healthy life, and I certainly wasn't happy, and I certainly wasn't dealing with what, you know, was actually just some pretty traumatic stuff. You know, the list is building here. During this time, I did what a lot of cocky fighter pilots do when they go through a divorce, is I found a woman who's way too young, way too hot, and way too crazy. And yay! So I got into a relationship with her, and I'm going to be very, very candid with you here, because I think it's important for people to understand, you know, what you go through with this. We found very creative ways to be intimate. I credited her for being very patient and very loving. I didn't feel good about myself. I was less of a man than I had been. And I thought she had given me a tremendous gift. And in a way, she had. And it helped me get through it. Unfortunately, I have a tendency to feel overly obligated when I'm grateful to someone for something. And turns out she had borderline personality disorder. So I'm not kidding. Nobody bothered to tell me. So that caused a whole bunch of other problems. So I retired out of that job, and the first thing I was going to do, that was 2012 when I retired from the Navy, 4 years in the Air Force, 16 years in the Navy. And this woman came with me down to Virginia Beach, where I started my next life. I'd started a streaming video company, which was pretty edgy back in those days. I did pretty well with that. It's interesting now. So you come out of this combat environment, you're operating at this very high level of stress all the time. You can actually use that to be effective. I moved mountains. I built new technology. I built a data center. I had massive amounts of automation and remote access stuff. And I built this streaming television company called American TV to Go. I was the first one in the United States to stream live satellite television outside the United States. It was pretty cool. My inner geek was still strong, and I made that happen. A lot of it's because I just didn't sleep. I just went and went and went. I also had this crazy woman that I was dealing with, and that eventually culminated in a single panic attack. Just one. Now, I used to think a panic attack was an excuse that a weak-minded person makes because they can't keep their shit together, right? And that's not, I assure you that's not it. You know, when I had one, and I've only had one ever in my life, I thought I was dying. I did. I was breathing heavy. I was sweating. My heart was pounding. I felt lightheaded and dizzy, and it was just awful. I thought I was dying. So I called my doctor up and said, "Doc, here's what's going on." And he said, "All right, I'm going to write you a script. You got to run down to the pharmacy, and you got to get this script right away." No, it's even worse than that. It's Ativan. I'd never heard of Ativan. I was a multivitamin and aspirin guy. Seriously, I just would never consider an antidepressant. I didn't know what I was getting into with the Ativan, but he put me on 2 milligrams of Ativan a day and left me there for 4.5 years. I did not know what a benzodiazepine was. I didn't think I really even understood it was a tranquilizer. It was just this little tiny pill, 0.5 milligram. Nothing, a little tiny thing. It couldn't be that bad, right? Didn't warn me about tolerance. Didn't warn me about paradoxical effects. Didn't warn me about dangerous withdrawal. Didn't warn me about interactions with alcohol. None of it. He just wrote me this script. Got rid of the crazy girlfriend, by the way, right after that. She was gone. It was clear that I needed to do that. And so for some time after that, I functioned very well. I built my business. I built one of the biggest, I think at the time was the largest Bitcoin mining operation in North America. I had a building that never had snow on the roof. The guys down at the power plant were always throwing extra switches for me. It was quite an operation, and I did pretty well with the Bitcoin for a while. What I didn't realize is I was slowly building tolerance to this stuff. He put me on 2 milligrams a day and just left me there, and I dutifully took it as prescribed. I went to his office every few months and reported back what was going on. For a while, that was fine. After a couple of years, though, I was crawling out of my skin. I had developed a tolerance, and without adjusting my dosage up, I was in constant tolerance withdrawal. So now I'm taking a tranquilizer, which makes me feel a little bit better every time I take it. But my baseline anxiety is going through the roof, and it was very insidious. Like I said, it took years, but every time I took this little pill, I felt a little better. So I thought it was me. Never occurred to me that it was the pill because this stuff hadn't been disclosed to me. It got to the point where my anxiety was so bad, I was crawling out of my skin. I completely destroyed my business. I pissed away what should have been about $22 million worth of Bitcoin. I just couldn't make decisions. I had some technical problems in my network. I couldn't analyze anything. I just couldn't allocate resources appropriately. I just ruined, this beautiful thing. I experienced depersonalization, this idea that I'm walking around outside of myself, watching my body live my life without a lot of input from me. Derealization, this idea that nothing's real around you, there's no consequences for anything. I experienced severe disinhibition, kind of like being drunk all the time. You could have told me to do just about anything, and I would. And my life pretty much fell apart. I couldn't pay my bills. I couldn't take care of myself. I couldn't do anything. I was just a walking zombie crawling out of my skin. Eventually turned to cannabis, first to get a little bit of sleep. It worked for a while. But then I needed more and more of that. And I needed to use it earlier and earlier in the day. It got to the point where I would wake up, fire up, and just be lazy. It was the only way I could stand being in my own skin. I was self-medicating. I didn't understand what that was at the time, but I was doing what I had to do to feel better. Unfortunately, I'm a 20-year military veteran, a senior officer. I don't really know where to get marijuana and all that other stuff, so I ended up hanging out. Seriously, it was hard back then. Ended up making contact with some fairly unsavory folks, forgetting people I wouldn't normally associate with. They saw that I had some money, and they took advantage of me. It wasn't long before I became a raging cocaine addict, sticking needles in my arms, heroin, meth, you name it, anything I get in a needle. I thought needles were cool. That's how screwed up my brain was. That was a very short period during which I did that sort of horrible thing. I'm lucky to be alive. Who knows what they were giving me? I mean, it's stuff off the street. I tore my arms up pretty bad. It was cut with borax or who knows, baby powder, I don't know. But my arms were rotting off, and I looked at myself one day and said, I gotta go do something about this. So I went back to the prescribing doc, and I said, hey doc, look what I'm doing to myself. He looks at me and says, you gotta go to rehab. I'm like, yeah, no shit. I gotta go to rehab. So he says, first we gotta get you off the Ativan. So he cold turkeyed me. Yeah, no, it was not good. It turns out that the neuroadaptations that occur when you're taking this stuff for a long time are insidious and profound. I won't go deep into the neuroscience because I think I'm probably going long here a little bit, but physical neuroadaptations happen that try to undermine and counteract this drug, and those things don't return to normal quickly. And when you remove the drug, even though the dose I was taking was not nearly enough to keep me in any kind of normal state, it's like you compress this giant spring and it just goes boom. So what happened to me was, I believe I was probably close to having a seizure. I was foaming at the mouth. I felt like cold ice water was running down my head every few minutes. I was shaking. heat, sound, light, everything was super intense for me. I couldn't stand the sound of the air conditioning in my house. I didn't know this was the Ativan. I had no idea. Remember, I hadn't been warned. I didn't even know how this stuff worked. I knew nothing about it at this point. I thought I was just having some kind of meltdown. I didn't know what was wrong. It was me. It had to be me, right? So I call the doctor's office up, and I go, Doc, I don't know what's going on with me. And he goes, oh, it's stress. Okay, I didn't really like that answer, but I call my brother up, and so I get on the Google now. Now we have the Google. So I get on Google, I start Googling my plethora of bizarre symptoms, and I come up with multiple sclerosis. Common misdiagnosis in people who are going through benzodiazepine withdrawal. Remember, I didn't know what a benzodiazepine was yet. My brother has multiple sclerosis. So I call my brother up. I say, Scott, I got this, and this, and this. And he says, you got it bad, dude. You need to go see the doctor. You're going to die. I said, okay. So I call my GP, 2 weeks to get an appointment. I begged. I pleaded. I told him, whoever was on the phone, they just weren't listening to me. So I got my appointment for 2 weeks and resign myself to just toughing it out. My brother called me up the next day and said, hey, are you taking any benzos? What's a benzo? Benzodiazepines. What's a benzodiazepine? I don't know. Word alphabet soup, right? So he starts listing off various benzodiazepines. He gets down to Ativan, and I say, stop, that's the one. Ativan, I've been taking it for years. He goes, man, you're going through benzodiazepine withdrawal. I said, what? He said, look it up. So I looked it up. Yeah, no shit, I was going through benzodiazepine withdrawal. Call the doctor's office up again. Now he's on vacation. Really had to beat him up to get him on the phone. He gets on the phone. He's pissed because I'm bothering him. And now I have to convince him that I'm going through benzodiazepine withdrawal. Again, he tells me it's stress. He must have got on the Google too, because later that night he called me up and said, okay, maybe you are going through benzodiazepine withdrawal. I'm going to prescribe you Valium. Another fucking benzodiazepine? Really? I don't want the Valium. But, I'm out of my mind at this point. I'll do just about anything to feel better. So he writes me a script for Valium, sends it to my mail order pharmacy, despite the fact I told him I needed it right away. So 10 days go by before the Valium shows up. By the way, he was correct to prescribe me Valium. That is the correct way to taper off of a short half-life benzodiazepine. You have to replace it with a long half-life benzodiazepine and then go through a very long, painful process of tapering back off. But I didn't know this at this point. The other thing he didn't know is he prescribed me 2 milligrams of Valium. Well, the equivalent dosage of Valium is 20 milligrams. So even if I took it, it wouldn't have worked. And I hated this guy at this point, so screw him. But 10 days later, when the Valium finally showed up, I had gone up the backside of the acute withdrawal curve. I was on my way back down, and in my linear mind, I was getting better rapidly. And I thought, I'm going to be fine in a couple of months. No way I'm touching another one of these medications. I'm going to tough it out. So I sat in a darkened room for 7 months with noise-canceling headphones on, air conditioning at 65, rocking back and forth, trying to convince myself not to blow my head off. I literally lived from minute to minute for months. I slept for no more than half an hour, maybe an hour, for many, many months after that. I just went through absolute hell. But during that time, I read everything I could find about benzodiazepines. Finally came to understand the mechanisms and that, you needed a replacement and you had to taper off and all that stuff. So very, very hard to find a doctor who knows how to do that. I was lucky. The former chief of medicine from Portsmouth Naval Medical Center had been doing this for many years, and I can't remember how I stumbled across this guy, but that guy was my angel. We figured I was on about 20 milligrams of Valium, and it took me 2.5 years to taper off of it. The Valium took the edge off of it, but I was not functioning. I laid on the couch for 2.5 years, basically doing nothing. Stuck a pistol in my mouth more times than I can count. It was just excruciating. The suicide rate for people going through that is astronomically high. I see some people know that. I got a lot of nodding over here. Yeah, this is rough stuff, guys. This is not an uncommon story. This is what's so alarming. We have so many problems at veterans health care. I left out a part. Let me go back real quick to the VA. I now know some senior people in the VA. I know some deck plate people in the VA. They're good people. They mean well. They do the best they can with their jobs. They're under-resourced and handcuffed by the bureaucratic machine that makes them completely ineffective, not agile, almost useless, and a waste of money in a lot of cases. They do some good things. But for guys coming back with PTSD, putting them on benzodiazepines certainly is bad enough. That was one med for me. I know plenty of guys are on 10, 12, 15 medications. As the side effects come up, they just give them another one to treat the side effects. Nobody knows what the interactions on these drugs are. These polypharma cases are disasters. This is why 44 veterans a day are killing themselves. It's not 22 anymore. I don't know if you guys saw that study. Duke and the University of Alabama just put out a study. They had neglected guys on active duty and drug overdoses. So that 22 a day, that's the old number. It's more like 44 a day. I kind of wonder if it's higher. But anyway, I went to the VA. I went through about 18 months of an administrative maze that led to no cheese whatsoever. I eventually got an incompetent provider who, I walked in there, spilled my guts like I just did to you. And she nodded and smiled and said, oh, we're gonna do all these great things for you, meds and counseling and all this great stuff. And then I come back the next week and she's like, okay, remind me your story again. She didn't take any notes. Well, that was my last appointment with her. So I left that part out, or that was earlier. So I was done with the VA. There was no chance I was going back to the VA at that point. So I'll get to the end of the story here. I'm fine right now, by the way. Great to be here. Had a car accident on the way here in the rain. Yeah, smashed my truck up pretty good. I'm surprised I was able to get here, to be honest with you. You can't kill me. You can try. Can't kill myself. So the last chapter of my story, and then I'll get down off stage because I'm sure I've hogged up too much time here. 2.5 years of tapering off the Valium. That was over about 2 years ago. What I found once I got off the Valium is all these traumas from combat, from prostate cancer, from the hot, crazy girlfriend, from all this stuff. All this stuff was still there. I wasn't processing any of it because I was medicated out of my mind. So all this stuff was still there. So I started feeling better from the benzodiazepines. I still have some symptoms, but started feeling a lot better. But now I had all this trauma that was 10 years old plus. Hadn't been processed at all. So I was able to get up and move around, and I got up to 260 pounds there at one point. I'm back to about 210 now. I got a little more to go. I was just living a miserable life, and I needed to do something about that. But I was just so happy to be alive at that point. I wasn't necessarily seeking anything. And this is where Kid and I reconnected. So Kid is part of an options trading group called Top Gun Options. The guy who runs that, his name's Wiz Buckley, another fighter pilot, did really well in the markets after he got out of the Navy and started a charitable foundation called the Top Gun Fighter Foundation that does all kinds of stuff. I think, Bing, you know him from way back, don't you? You were Squadron Bros, I think, way back, yeah. He was a good dude. So he did really, really well. And he wanted to start using that money he made for some good. So he started the Top Gun Fighter Foundation. And he did all kinds of things with that money. There wasn't any really narrow channel for anything, but he was approached by a SEAL by the name of Marcus Capone. Marcus Capone has an interesting story. Marcus was 13 years on the SEAL teams. He was on SEAL Team 6. Those are the guys that do all the black ops and all that stuff. I think he had 7 or 8 deployments to Afghanistan, and he was just an absolute mess. Raging PTSD case. He was medically discharged, medically retired, returned home to his wife Amber and their kids, and basically went down the same road I did. He was on all kinds of pharma. I think he was on a dozen meds at one point. Alcoholic, rage, just not functioning. It was just tearing the family apart. The guy was a mess. And he went through every conceivable modality that you can think of to try to deal with this stuff. Nothing worked. He was about to lose his family. And out of desperation, he went down to Mexico and did this thing called Ibogaine. Anyone here heard of Ibogaine? It's really esoteric. So Ibogaine is, well, kid knows. Ibogaine is what most people would call a psychedelic, kind of like ayahuasca or psilocybin. There's a whole bunch of them out there. Peyote. I don't really like the word psilocybin or psychedelic. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. I would call these medicines, and they are medicines, by the way, not necessarily accepted in our normal Western framework right now, but we're working on that. These things pop out of the ground. If you go to South America, these are deeply understood, and part of these indigenous cultures, it's just the way. You eat this plant, you see your ancestors, you meet God, whatever, you become connected to everything around you, and it's very healing. So Marcus found this Ibogaine therapy. He went down to Mexico, did it, came back a few days later, walked in the door. You should hear Amber tell the story. It's wonderful. I tear up every time I hear it. She said, I got my husband back. She didn't have to say anything. She just walked in the door. She said, I got my husband back. The guy was a mess. Boom, like that. Better. So Marcus went to Wiz. Marcus and Amber started something called VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions. So Marcus wanted to take this to other guys in the SEAL community. And he did. He just started rounding up his bros and finding ways to pay for them to go down and do this psychedelic-assisted therapy down in Mexico, because this stuff isn't legal here. All this stuff is Schedule I. There's a whole story behind that. Has anyone seen the Netflix series How to Change Your Mind? Yeah? Have you seen 9 Perfect Strangers? That was a go. You should check that out. There's a book, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. Everybody has to read it. If you're anywhere near veterans' health issues, you have to read that book. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. It is the definitive primer on this stuff, the history of it, how it works. There's a lot of new science coming out that actually supports what these indigenous cultures have known for thousands of years. We're going to put that all together. But anyway, Marcus starts VETS. He needs some money. He finds Wiz. He goes to Wiz, says, hey, Wiz, here's my story. Will you help us out? Wiz strokes him a check for mid-6 figures at dinner and says, oh my God, dude, we need to help these guys. And by the way, I'm a mess too. Wiz went down. He did the same treatment that Marcus did. He went down there with Marcus Luttrell. You guys might know that name, the lone survivor. He went down with Marcus Luttrell, who had obvious reasons to be messed up after what he lived through, and an NFL football player who had CTE and had the same healing experience. So he came back, reported his experience to Top Gun Options. Now he's thinking, oh, well, there's investment opportunities here, right? So he's telling his options trading group. I have another F-14 buddy who's in that group, and he came running to me and said, Slider, you're a mess. You need to do this. That's a bunch of long-hair hippie bullshit, man. I'm an engineer. Vote Republican. I mean, whatever, dude. So Wiz did a video. He put it up on YouTube. It's called Wiz's Initial Debrief, where he tells the story of what he experienced down there and the power of the healing and all that stuff. And I listened to Wiz tell it, and I'll tell you why storytelling is so powerful and why I'm wasting all your time, hopefully not telling you all these stories. Because to hear him tell the story, to hear the story told by someone I know and trust from my community, highly trained professional community, very disciplined operators here. We're some of the most highly trained professionals in the world, I would argue. To hear a guy like him come back and tell me he went and did this crazy thing and it worked, gave me permission to do 2 things. One is to be a human and say, I need help. And I'll tell you, guys who spend a lot of time in combat, they can't ask for help. It's only a flesh wound. The other thing it did was it gave me hope that this might actually work. I went down and did it myself. Absolutely changed my life. I promise you I would not be standing here telling you the story right now if I hadn't done that. I wouldn't have given myself permission to be human. I wouldn't have been able to shed the shame of the horrible things I did to myself. I wouldn't have understood what the purpose of my life is. It had always been a mission that someone else gave to me. That's not the purpose of my life. My purpose of my life is to love you guys. I would argue that's the purpose of everyone's life. But these medicines show you this kind of thing. So, I would encourage you to look into this stuff. We're working on a documentary movie about it right now called No Fallen Heroes. Check it out on YouTube. The No Fallen Heroes Foundation. We're doing a lot of work. We're trying to change legislation at the federal level. We've already had some big successes at the state level. Colorado just passed a bill a couple days ago. So ayahuasca, Ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT, peyote, these things are all legal, at least at the state level. Federal level is a problem. So, for veterans on active duty to get these treatments, obviously we have some big stones to move here. But I will tell you this, having had the experience myself, I would argue that anyone coming back from a combat theater is a candidate for this stuff, because there is nothing else we know about that can take you out of that high state of alert that we end up calling PTSD when you're back here in the real world, and getting you back down to where you're operating like a normal human being and you can relate to your family, where you're not driving tactical down 95, not getting in fights in parking lots, not getting arrested, spent a few nights in jail. I was getting in fights all the time. I'm a lover, I'm not a fighter. But I was getting in fights. It's just, it's normal. This is normal, guys. It's a normal reaction to extraordinary experiences. And so the idea that you would need an extraordinary modality to deal with it, it shouldn't be that nuts. So that's it. If you guys want to talk about this more afterwards, happy to grab me, whatever. I'll give you all kinds of information, tell you where to look. Thank you for listening to my long-winded story. I'll finish the way I started. How many fighter pilots does it take to screw in a light bulb? It's just one. He just holds the light bulb and the world revolves around him.